If you're new to our channel, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.
Now back to the Wisconsin Vegetable Gardener Radio Show, which is presented to you by Power Planter Earth Augers, the official digging tool. To find the right size for your digging project, visit powerplanter.com. Now here are your hosts, Joey and Holly Baird.
As one of the country's most recognized and trusted personalities in gardening and green living, that passion for living a greener life is evident to a nationwide audience who watches Joe Lampl in his current role as the creator, executive producer, and host of the multi-award-winning PBS series Growing a Greener World. He is also an author, blogger, and more. Welcome to the program, Joe.
Hey, Holly. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedule, as it always seems to be, to join Holly, myself, and all of our listeners from across the country to enlighten us and them.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, many people have trees in their yard, on their property, and they always think, when can I trim them? Is it okay to trim now in early spring? Should I wait until fall? Should I have done it in fall? What's the best time to trim a tree, whether it's fruit or non-ornamental?
Yeah, no, my recommendation is always to do it in late winter, early spring, before you have bud break or leaf break, so that you can see the structure of the tree. That's the best time that you can find those dead disease or crossing limbs or anything that you feel like is competing with another limb, and you're able to see the structure of the tree so that you can take out that limb that's less desirable than the other one. So it's the really only time of the year that you have that chance to really look into the skeleton to see how it's shaped, and then that creates the ideal framework with your hand in there to do some proper pruning to give it the best structure as possible. But having said that, the next best time to come in there is, early summer to midsummer, because then, even though it's filled out and you've maybe done some pruning in the early winter, now you see what it looks like with all the leaves out, and how you still may want to go in there and do a little more pruning to create greater air circulation or more light into the center of the canopy, at which point the summer is actually the best time to do it. The worst time, though, in my opinion, is to do it in fall or late fall, as the tree is going into dormancy, because, as you all know, pruning stimulates growth. So if you were to prune in the fall, right before the tree goes dormant, and you make a cut, it may stimulate new growth, like there may be a new surge of new growth that could be harmed when the cold weather comes on. So you want to avoid that, and all you have to do is wait a few more months until you're coming out of winter into spring, and then go back in there and make that pruning then.
Well, with that said, what is one of the more common mistakes that tree pruners do? Is it over pruning, under pruning, or is it really pruning at the wrong time, or a combination of all?
Well, I think it's, pruning at the wrong time is never good, but I think sometimes it's under pruning, because, pruning is actually good and healthy for the tree, and it creates that increased light and air circulation that without our help sometimes isn't going to happen. And it gives us an opportunity to get those crossing branches out of the way and introduce more openness into the canopy. Now, having said that, I have seen a lot of tragedy with pruning, and typically that is with topping, where it's indiscriminate, just taking a chainsaw and going straight across the top of the tree like a tabletop without any thought as to how the tree is growing and where you make the proper cut. They're just taking a tabletop approach and topping the tree. That is the biggest mistake. Indiscriminate topping of a tree without regard to the structure and how it grows. That's the worst thing.
Well, in theory, what is the purpose of the tabletop trimming? Is it just convenience or uneducation?
It's uneducation. Okay. It's lack of education. There's no horticultural basis for doing that whatsoever. In fact, it's discouraged by any arborist or horticulturalist that knows anything about tree care and proper pruning would discourage tabletop tree topping. And so it's lack of education, and the people that do it play off the fear of the homeowners and the tree owners that have those trees, And the basis of it is that the fear factor is that branch, those big branches are going to break off in the wintertime and fall on their house. And so they succumb to that pitch, and they go ahead and acquiesce and allow the tree to be tabletopped. And it ruins the tree, Joey and Holly, and to the point that if it's done repetitively over the course of just a few years, that tree is going to die. Because what it wants to do is put out new growth as fast as possible to replace its engine to produce the photosynthetic energy it needs to grow. And having just lost its main branches, the only thing it can do is send out water sprouts, which are those rapidly growing vertical shoots that are poorly attached to the main stem. So if you think you've got a problem of your branches falling off and under winter snow pressure and so forth, now you've really made that problem worse, because those new water sprouts that come out from the main branch, those are the weakest attached branches on the entire tree. The best branches were the ones that guy came and cut off when he tabletopped it. So it's a fear thing that's unwarranted and ill-advised.
Okay, that's definitely really good to know. Now, we always talk about killer compost every time you come on the show, but it's really worth repeating. This is something that could happen to just about anybody. What is killer compost? And you had to deal with this personally in your raised beds. Could you share with us what happened?
Okay, so killer compost is basically using composted horse manure that came from hay that was grown in fields that was sprayed with persistent herbicides. So I'm talking about Grazon, imidacloprid, and different persistent herbicides that are so, they just don't break down naturally. In fact, they're designed not to break down. And so over 4 or 5 years after composting, they're still intact, and that herbicide can kill but many plants that come in contact with it. And so when gardeners unknowingly use horse manure, composted horse manure that happened to have hay that was treated with this persistent herbicide, that can pass through to the gardener's use of it in the garden soil. And that's when it can kill your plants and ruin your soil. And the reason I know about it is because I'm well researched on it, but I also, even knowing that, I couldn't resist the temptation to use my own composted horse manure from my own farm and my own horses when I built my raised bed garden. And I put 20% of my bed, I used the composted horse manure on my property without checking first to see if it had the persistent herbicide in it, and it did. And as soon as I got the horse manure in my garden beds and the plants started growing and the roots came in contact with that persistent herbicide, suddenly my plants started curling up and becoming deformed, and it was very apparent what had happened. I knew immediately when I saw it what had happened, and I did it to my own garden. I couldn't believe it. I was so mad at myself, but, live and learn. It happens to the best of us. And so you have to be careful with anytime you're using animal manure in your garden, you have to be sure before you put it into your garden that it's free of any persistent herbicide.
Well, this can be true for weed and feed, inorganic weed and feed that people take the grass clippings and compost and throw in their yard or in their garden, because that weed and feed is to kill the broadleaf plants in the yard to make the grass grow. And it's persistent, and even in the compostable form, so it can be the same detrimental effect that you went through on a much smaller level, but still as deadly.
It can be the same. The difference is that the type of herbicide that's sold commercially for agricultural use, for example, for farmers that are growing out grass for hay harvesting, that herbicide is less available in the consumer market and more for the commercial market, and that is the type of synthetic herbicide that is incredibly persistent, much more persistent than what you or I might purchase in a garden center or a nursery, but the result can be definitely the same. The difference is the duration or persistence of the herbicide on the commercial level.
Right. Well, as we get closer to planting each day, many people, and I'm asking you this because you're an expert in this field, you've got raised beds, and the myth or the saying or the knowledge has been passed around that if you're growing in raised beds, you can plant these plants a whole lot closer than you could in traditional ground because you're growing them in really rich nutrient soil. Is there any truth to that, or is this just another garden myth that we've all been led to believe?
I'd say it's a myth. You want good garden soil, whether it's in ground or in raised beds. the raised bed environment is definitely an advantage for being able to create the ideal soil mix for sure. You get better drainage and all these other better properties that you have more control over. But the plants still demand air and light, air circulation and light opportunity. And so, soil has nothing to do with that. The fact that you would be planting them closer together doesn't do anything that's good for that plant. They still want to have that air circulation and as much light as possible around them because they don't want to be crowded just because they're in a raised bed and they have better soil. That does have some advantages over inferior soil, but there's no reason you can't have great soil in an in-ground bed either. But no matter where you plant your plants, you still need to give them good air and light circulation.
Definitely. Now let's, as we try to start as many plants as we can from seed, but we do pick up plants from the Independent Garden Center, and there's nothing wrong with that. What are a few tips you can share when it comes to picking out those plants from your local garden center?
Well, first of all, you want to, I do this all the time. I pull the plant out of the container, and a garden center owner or somebody that works at a garden center that knows their salt is going to know that you are obviously an astute gardener. If you're checking the root mass or the root system, you're looking for healthy roots, and healthy roots look white or fresh. They don't stink. They're not brown and kind of rotty. And that's the first thing that I do. And of course, I'm certainly looking at the above ground growth, anything that has any signs of disease. And then I rub my hand over the top of it. And in case there's any white fly or some sort of pest flying out of the top of it upon disturbance, that's not a good indication because you don't want to take those plants and bring them home and introduce them into your garden and bring in those pests or those eggs that may exist on the plant that you bring into the garden that wasn't even in your original garden until you brought it in. So those are the main things. I'm trying to avoid bringing or introducing in pests and diseases or plants that are root bound and overcrowded inside of their container.
Some good advice there, Joe. Let's talk about the program that has made you well known throughout not only North America but around the world. You're in the 10th season of PBS's Growing a Greener World, and in those 10 seasons, you've met a lot of people and gone a lot of places. Is there a couple of moments or people or events that you have witnessed or been introduced to that really stands out in your mind as a really one of the things that's going to stick with you forever?
I'll give you three quick ones. The first one was the one we won our Emmy on. It's Stephen Ritz with the Green Bronx Machine in the Bronx, New York. He's a school teacher. Now he's a volunteer school teacher, and he introduced his children, his students who live in public housing across the street from the school, and they're overweight, they're undernourished, their grades were terrible, their attendance was terrible, their attitudes were terrible, and Stephen Ritz, as a dedicated teacher, wanted to solve that problem, and he felt like the best way he could do that was to teach them about gardening and eating healthy. So he started growing food inside the classrooms and in the schoolyard garden and taught the kids not only how to grow that food, but what to do with it once they harvested it. So they started creating salads and learning recipes and making those dishes inside the school classroom, and they had so much left over that they could take it to the school cafeteria and share it with the other students and then send it home. Then they could take it to their parents at the end of the day, and they would cook at night with this produce that the kids had made in school. So the short story to that is that the grades went up, the weight went down, the attendance went up. Everything that you would want to improve upon happened through connecting these kids to the miracle of growing food and eating a more healthy diet. So that's the first one. The second one was Jason Brown. He's an ex-former NFL football player who was the highest paid center in the league at the time. At 29 years old, he had a $35 million contract for the NFL that he walked away from with his 7 kids to start a farm in North Carolina, outside of Raleigh, North Carolina. And he named his farm First Fruits Farm. He'd never farmed before, but he was so used to learning how to do things through YouTube. As a pro football player, you learn how to scout your team by watching videos. So he figured he could learn to be a farmer by watching video, which is what he did. But here's the neat thing about it. 9 years in now, he's grown about 1 million pounds of produce, and he's donated every pound of it to his community. Not only the first fruits, but everything that he's grown and harvested has been donated. So this is a guy with a really incredible heart, and he walked away in faith to start this farm with this very, very lucrative career. And then the last one is just kind of a personal hero for me, Margaret Roach, who lives outside of New York City, about hour and a half north. And she gardens on 2.5 acres. She's an organic gardener. She's just kind of the poster child for who I would consider growing a greener world icon. She is sensitive to the environment. She loves nature. She understands biodiversity and creating healthy habitats. And everything she does, she gardens to improve her natural surroundings and to benefit wildlife. And in the process, she creates the most beautiful gardens that you've practically ever seen. And she's just got a heart for teaching too. So not only does she do this for herself, but she does it more to educate the public through her podcast, A Way to Garden, and through her website, and through just all her access that she provides. She's very accessible. She actually worked for Martha Stewart for 25 years and ran her website and her gardening columns, and very many aspects of Martha Stewart's empire is attributable to Margaret Roach's influence over 25 years of working with her. But about 10 or 12 or 15 years ago, Margaret retired and moved up to her little farmhouse in upstate New York to garden full-time and to become a full-time garden writer. And she's got some great books and a great website. And she's a dear friend, but she's a great role model for gardening, especially organic gardening.
Those are some great wow moments. Now, where can people find more about you and your show if they don't already know?
Yeah, JoeGardener.com is the very best place to go to get access to our YouTube channel, Joe Gardener TV, and our television show, Growing a Greener World. But that website is growingagreenerworld.com. That's the name of the show, and then it's just .com after that. But, we've got online courses at Joe Gardener, and we've got lots of educational opportunities, and the podcast, the Joe Gardener Show podcast, is there at joegardener.com/podcast. And so those are the main hubs, Holly. And if you Google my name or Joe Gardener, you're going to find me as well as all the different ways that you can access the information.
Well, Joe, we greatly appreciate you taking time out of your day and sharing your wisdom with us and some of the stories that have made Growing a Greener World what it is today.
Thanks, Joey and Holly. I appreciate the opportunity.
Absolutely.
For more information, please visit thewisconsinvegetablegardener.com.